Long before theological systems were formalized, and centuries before later doctrines attempted to explain the origin of evil, the Hebrew Scriptures preserved a brief and deeply troubling fragment. It appears without warning, offers no commentary, and then vanishes as quickly as it emerges. Yet, this fragment would become one of the most debated passages in biblical history, precisely because of what it implies about the boundary between the divine and the human. The text speaks of a time when humanity began to multiply upon the face of the earth, when daughters were born and societies expanded across the ancient landscape. Into this growing world, beings identified as the sons of God are said to have observed human women, recognized their beauty, and took wives for themselves. No explanation is offered, no names are given. The narrative moves on as if the reader already understands the gravity of what has just occurred. For generations, scribes and scholars struggled with this moment. In the Hebrew language, the phrase used for these beings is not ambiguous. It appears elsewhere in Scripture to describe members of the divine council, heavenly entities who stand before God and carry out assigned roles. In ancient Israelite thought, this phrase never refers to ordinary human rulers or noble lineages. It belongs to the realm of the divine. The discomfort this passage created is evident in later interpretations that attempted to soften its meaning. Some traditions propose that these sons of God were merely human elites or descendants of a righteous lineage. Yet, these explanations arise centuries after the text itself and reflect theological anxiety more than linguistic evidence. Earlier Jewish readers did not hesitate. They understood the passage literally and felt compelled to explain it, not explain it away. During the Second Temple period, when Jewish scholars sought to preserve ancestral traditions threatened by exile, foreign rule, and cultural erosion, this brief biblical fragment became the foundation for an expansive narrative. Texts such as the Book of the Watchers, now preserved within 1st Enoch, did not invent a new story. They claimed to reveal what had always been known, but rarely spoken aloud. In these writings, the beings from Genesis receive a title, Watchers. The name reflects their original function. They were appointed observers, guardians assigned to oversee the earth and humanity's development. Their task was not to rule, but to witness, to maintain order, by remaining distinct from what they observed. This separation was essential. Heaven and earth were different realms, governed by different laws. The Watcher's failure is therefore not framed as ignorance, but as deliberate violation. Ancient Jewish authors emphasize that these beings possessed knowledge far beyond humanity. They understood consequence, permanence, and divine law. When they descended, it was not a moment of weakness, but a collective decision sealed by oath. In Semitic cultures, oaths were binding unto death. To swear together was to remove all possibility of retreat. This framing matters because it reveals how ancient writers understood evil. It was not chaos alone, nor simple rebellion. It was boundary violation. The order of creation depended on separation, light from darkness, waters above from waters below, divine from mortal. The Watchers crossed a line that structured reality itself. Human women within these texts are not portrayed as mythical temptresses, nor as passive symbols. They are real participants in a real world, living within ancient societies where lineage determined inheritance, identity, and survival. The union between Watchers and women threatened not only spiritual order, but human continuity. The offspring of such unions could not belong fully to either realm. These children are described using terms that resist simple translation. They are called mighty ones, violent ones, men whose names endured. Later traditions render them as giants, not merely in physical stature, but in influence and destruction. Their presence coincides with a world described as filled with bloodshed, lawlessness, and grief. Ancient writers did not separate moral decay from environmental collapse. Violence corrupted the land itself. The earth cried out, polluted by blood, unable to sustain life as it once had. In this worldview, cosmic disorder manifests visibly. What begins in the heavens poisons the soil beneath human feet. The Watcher's story therefore serves as more than mythic explanation. It functions as a theological diagnosis. Knowledge delivered without restraint becomes weaponized. Power introduced prematurely destabilizes fragile societies. The Watchers taught metallurgy for war, enchantments that bound minds, astronomical secrets meant for divine administration. Humanity was not prepared for such gifts. By the time divine judgment is described, it unfolds with legal precision. Accusations are presented, witnesses are named, sentences are assigned. The Watchers are bound and imprisoned, not annihilated. Their offspring are destroyed, but something remains. According to these texts, the spirits of the dead giants linger, unable to ascend, condemned to wander the earth. This belief would shape Jewish demonology for centuries and deeply influence early Christian thought. Evil spirits were not fallen angels in the modern sense, but the residual consciousness of beings born from forbidden union. They were restless because they had no rightful place in creation. The original biblical fragment never explains this. It merely gestures toward a catastrophe so severe that human lifespan is curtailed and divine patience reaches its limit. The flood narrative that follows is not introduced as random punishment, but as necessary containment. The world must be reset because its foundations have been compromised. The story of the Watchers survives not because it was comfortable, but because it answered questions ancient people could not ignore. Why is violence so deeply rooted? Why does knowledge corrupt as often as it enlightens? Why does humanity seem haunted by impulses it cannot master? These texts offered a sobering answer. Some boundaries exist not to restrict growth, but to preserve life. When those boundaries are crossed, the consequences echo far beyond the moment of transgression. The figure known as the Watcher did not originate within later apocalyptic imagination. Its roots lie deep within the intellectual and religious soil of the ancient Near East, where divine beings were understood to operate within structured hierarchies rather than chaotic pantheons. In this worldview, the cosmos functioned through delegated authority. Supreme divinity did not act alone, but presided over a council of subordinate beings tasked with governance, observation, and execution of divine will. Hebrew tradition preserves traces of this structure in scattered but consistent language. Heavenly beings are depicted standing before God, presenting reports, receiving assignments, and participating in judgment. They are not independent gods, nor are they metaphors for human rulers. They are celestial intelligences whose existence is assumed rather than argued. The ancient audience did not question their reality any more than they questioned the existence of the sky. The term translated as watcher appears most explicitly in Aramaic texts associated with the Second Temple period, particularly in traditions connected to Daniel and Enoch. Linguistically, The word conveys wakefulness, vigilance, and unbroken attention. A watcher is one who never sleeps, one whose task is constant awareness. In Mesopotamian royal ideology, similar figures appear as divine overseers assigned to cities, kings, and territories. These beings were believed to ensure cosmic order by maintaining proper boundaries between realms. Jewish writers did not invent this concept in isolation. They reinterpreted a familiar ancient idea through the lens of covenant theology. In their retelling, the Watchers were not merely guardians of human affairs, but moral agents accountable to divine law. Their authority did not grant autonomy. Observation did not permit participation. This distinction becomes central to understanding the severity of their transgression. To observe humanity was permitted. To instruct humanity within defined limits was permitted. To merge with humanity was not. The separation between divine beings and humans was not a matter of status alone, but of function. Each realm had its own role within creation, and stability depended on those roles remaining intact. Second Temple texts emphasize that the Watchers were fully aware of this order. They are described as ancient, luminous, and knowledgeable, possessing insight into the workings of the heavens. Their descent to earth is therefore portrayed as a conscious breach rather than a misunderstanding. The narrative insists on responsibility. These beings knew the law they were breaking. One of the most striking features of the Watchers' story is the emphasis placed on collective decision-making. They do not fall individually. They descend together. According to preserved traditions, they gather, debate, and ultimately bind themselves through a shared oath. This detail reflects ancient legal realities. An oath sworn by many carried communal consequence. No individual could withdraw without implicating the others. The act created mutual liability. In this way, the Watchers' descent mirrors human political failures familiar to the ancient world. Leaders who conspire together share guilt together. Authority abused in unity produces catastrophe on a scale no individual could achieve alone. The text thus collapses the distance between heaven and earth, portraying cosmic rebellion in terms humans understood all too well. The mountain imagery associated with the Watchers' descent is not incidental. Mountains functioned in ancient thought as liminal spaces, places where heaven and earth nearly touched. Divine encounters, covenants, and revelations frequently occurred on elevated ground. By situating the Watcher's oath on a mountain, the tradition underscores the gravity of the moment. This was not a hidden crime, but a public violation of cosmic order. The choice of human women as partners further complicates the narrative. In the ancient world, marriage was not primarily romantic. It was economic, legal, and genealogical. To take a wife was to establish lineage, inheritance, and future identity. By entering into marriage, the Watchers were not engaging in temporary desire, but attempting to embed themselves permanently within human history. This act challenged the very definition of humanity. Ancient Jewish identity was built upon genealogy. To know who you were meant knowing where you came from. A lineage that crossed realms introduced an unsolvable problem. These children could not be fully human, yet they were born into human societies. They disrupted every social category that sustained order. The text described the resulting offspring using language that emphasizes excess. They consume beyond measure. They dominate without restraint. They turn against humanity itself. Whether these descriptions are understood literally, symbolically, or as a combination of both, the point remains consistent. These beings represent imbalance. They are too much for the world to contain. The violence attributed to them is not random. It is portrayed as systemic. Bloodshed fills the earth. Justice collapses. The strong devour the weak. Ancient authors saw such conditions not as natural human progression, but as evidence of cosmic interference. When divine boundaries are breached, human society becomes unlivable. The Watcher's influence extends beyond physical domination. They introduce knowledge that accelerates destruction. Techniques of warfare transform interpersonal conflict into mass slaughter. Magical practices undermine communal trust. The manipulation of natural forces destabilizes agriculture and survival. Each form of knowledge introduced serves power rather than wisdom. In these accounts, knowledge itself is not condemned. What is condemned is timing and authority. Wisdom belongs within an ordered framework. When knowledge arrives divorced from moral structure, it amplifies humanity's capacity for harm. The Watchers do not teach humanity how to flourish. They teach humanity how to dominate. Divine response, when it comes, reflects ancient judicial logic rather than emotional reaction. Accusations are formalized. Messengers are sent. Judgment is pronounced according to role. The Watchers are punished because they violated their appointed function. Their offspring are destroyed because they cannot be integrated into creation. The earth is cleansed because it has been defiled beyond repair. This layered judgment reveals how ancient Jewish theology understood justice. Responsibility is assigned according to agency. Punishment is proportionate to role. The highest beings receive the most severe confinement. The land itself is treated as a moral participant, capable of corruption and restoration. By the time later biblical texts were compiled, much of this expanded narrative was no longer stated openly. The canonical scriptures preserve only the outline, not the explanation. Yet the silence itself suggests familiarity. The writers assumed their audience already knew the story. What needed to be remembered was not every detail, but the warning embedded within it. The Watchers stand as a symbol of misplaced authority, of power exercised without restraint, and of knowledge severed from responsibility. Their story insists that even divine beings are subject to law. Order is not maintained by strength alone, but by obedience to boundaries that sustain life. In this ancient telling, evil is not a mystery without origin. It is the consequence of choice. And its consequences, once unleashed, do not remain confined to those who made the decision. The decision that altered the course of the world is not presented in ancient texts as a sudden impulse or an uncontrollable fall. It is framed as deliberation. The Watchers are depicted as pausing, reflecting, and ultimately choosing to act in defiance of established order. This emphasis is intentional. Ancient Jewish writers sought to remove any ambiguity about responsibility. What follows is not tragedy born of ignorance, but consequence born of resolve. Central to this resolve is the oath. In the cultures of the ancient Near East, an oath was not a symbolic gesture. It was a binding act that invoked divine witness and guaranteed consequence. To swear an oath was to stake one's future, identity, and standing on the fulfillment of a vow. Breaking an oath did not merely invite punishment. It fractured trust at the most fundamental level of cosmic order. The Watcher's oath is therefore one of the most damning elements of the narrative. They are said to bind themselves together, agreeing that none would withdraw even if fear or regret arose. This detail reflects a legal reality well known to ancient audiences. Collective oaths were irreversible. They created shared guilt and shared fate. Once sworn, there was no mechanism for absolution through retreat. By presenting the descent as oath-bound, the texts remove any possibility that the watchers were coerced or deceived. They entered into transgression knowingly, together, and without external pressure. This transforms their act from personal failure into institutional collapse. Authority failed at the highest level entrusted with oversight. The descent itself is described with restraint rather than spectacle. There is no cosmic battle, no violent overthrow of heaven. The watchers do not seize power, they simply leave their appointed place. In ancient theology, this departure alone constitutes rebellion. Order depends not only on obedience, but on presence. To abandon one's station is to destabilize the structure that relies upon it. The location associated with their descent carries symbolic weight. Mountains, in ancient religious thought, were thresholds between realms. They were places of revelation, covenant, and judgment. By choosing such a place to swear their oath and descend, the watchers enact a parody of divine assembly. They misuse a sacred space to authorize a profane decision. Human women enter the narrative not as abstract figures, but as part of lived societies. They are daughters, members of households, bearers of lineage. In the ancient world, a woman's role in family continuity was central. Through her, names endured and inheritance passed. The watcher's choice to take wives therefore represents an attempt to root themselves permanently in human history. Marriage, in this context, is not incidental. It is covenantal. To marry was to claim legal and social standing. By entering into marriage, the watchers reject the temporary and seek permanence. They do not wish merely to experience humanity. They seek to alter it from within. The resulting offspring are described using layered language that blends physical, social, and moral excess. They grow beyond measure. They consume beyond need. They dominate beyond restraint. Whether understood as literal beings of unusual size or as symbolic representations of violent elites, the texts insist on the same outcome. The earth cannot sustain what has been introduced. Ancient authors consistently link size with threat. That which exceeds proper proportion becomes dangerous. In this worldview, balance is virtue. Excess is corruption. The giants represent imbalance made flesh. They are beings without limits in a world structured by limits. Violence is the inevitable consequence. The text describe bloodshed not as isolated acts, but as saturation. The land itself is said to be filled with violence. This language reflects an ancient belief that moral actions imprint themselves upon the physical world. Blood spilled unjustly pollutes the soil. The earth becomes complicit, bearing witness against its inhabitants. This ecological dimension is crucial. The crisis is not confined to human relationships. It spreads outward, affecting agriculture, survival, and stability. Crops fail. Order collapses. Life becomes unsustainable. In this framework, cosmic violation produces environmental consequence. Creation responds to moral disorder. The watcher's role in this escalation extends beyond reproduction. They are portrayed as instructors, introducing forms of knowledge that accelerate destruction. Weapons transform interpersonal conflict into organized slaughter. Enchantments manipulate perception and will. Divinatory practices replace trust in divine order with attempts at control. Ancient Jewish writers did not oppose knowledge itself. They opposed unauthorized knowledge. Wisdom was believed to belong within a moral hierarchy. Certain knowledge was reserved for divine administration. When revealed prematurely or without ethical framework, it became destructive. The Watchers do not teach wisdom. They teach technique divorced from restraint. This distinction explains why their punishment is portrayed as severe yet precise. They are not annihilated. They are restrained. Bound, confined, and removed from influence, they are prevented from further interference. The method of punishment reflects the nature of the crime. Those who abandoned their station are immobilized. Those who corrupted boundaries are confined beyond them. The fate of their offspring differs. The giants cannot be corrected or confined. They are removed entirely. Yet, even in destruction, consequence lingers. The texts describe their spirits as remaining restless and hostile, bound to the earth but denied embodiment. These spirits are not portrayed as fallen angels, but as remnants of an unnatural existence. This belief provides an origin for later concepts of unclean spirits. They are not cosmic rebels, but displaced beings, cut off from both heaven and earth. Their hostility toward humanity arises from envy and loss. They seek what they can no longer possess: physical experience, agency, and belonging. The biblical flood narrative, which follows the brief canonical reference to the sons of God, takes on new significance in this light. It is not simply punishment for moral failure. It is containment. The world must be cleansed because its structure has been compromised. The flood is a reset, not of humanity alone, but of cosmic order. What remains striking is how little of this is stated explicitly in the canonical text. The Bible preserves the outline, but leaves the explanation to tradition. This silence suggests that the story was once widely known. The writers did not need to explain what their audience already understood. The Watcher's story functions as a warning embedded in the foundations of Scripture. Authority without restraint destroys. Knowledge without order corrupts. Boundaries exist not to limit existence, but to preserve it. In this ancient theology, even beings of the heavens are subject to law. Power does not exempt from consequence. And when those entrusted with oversight choose participation over observation, the cost is borne by all of creation. Within the ancient texts, the involvement of human women is handled with deliberate care, avoiding both romanticization and simplification. These women are not presented as mythical archetypes, but as members of real communities shaped by kinship, labor, and survival. Their world was governed by lineage, honor, and continuity, and any disruption to that structure carried consequences far beyond the household. In the societies reflected by these writings, lineage was identity. A person's worth, inheritance, and legal standing flowed from ancestry. To introduce a lineage that could not be traced wholly within the human sphere was to destabilize the most basic social framework. Children born of mixed origin did not merely challenge theology. They fractured law, custom, and memory. The texts do not suggest that these unions occurred in isolation. They imply repetition, expansion, and normalization. What begins as transgression becomes pattern. Once boundaries are crossed without consequence, repetition follows. Ancient authors understood this dynamic well. Lawlessness spreads not through chaos alone, but through tolerated exception. The language used to describe these relationships reflects ancient covenant terminology. Taking wives was not a euphemism for violence alone, nor was it a neutral description of intimacy. It implies legitimacy, household formation, and long-term presence. This detail underscores the Watchers' intent. They were not passing through the human world. They were embedding themselves within it. This embedding produced a generation that ancient writers struggled to categorize. The offspring are not portrayed simply as larger humans, nor as lesser divine beings. They occupy an unstable middle ground. Their defining trait is not size alone, but dominance. They are described as consuming the labor of humanity, exhausting its resources, and turning against those who produced them. Ancient texts emphasize appetite as a moral category. To consume beyond need was to signal disorder. These beings devour crops, livestock, and eventually human life itself. Their hunger is portrayed as insatiable, reflecting an existence fundamentally out of alignment with the rhythms of creation. They take without sustaining. This portrayal aligns with broader, ancient Near Eastern fears of chaos figures who threaten agricultural stability. Societies dependent on seasonal cycles viewed excess as existential danger. A being that consumes without replenishing threatens survival itself. The giants thus become symbols of unsustainable power. Violence follows consumption. The texts describe a progression from exploitation to bloodshed. What begins as dominance becomes destruction. Communities collapse under pressure. Justice erodes. The strong rule by force alone. This is not depicted as isolated brutality, but as systemic transformation. Society becomes unrecognizable. The earth itself is said to react. Ancient Jewish thought did not separate morality from environment. Land could be polluted by bloodshed and injustice. Fields that once yielded abundance become barren. The natural order reflects moral disorder. Creation, in this worldview, responds to human and cosmic violation. This connection between violence and land appears repeatedly in biblical tradition. Blood cries out from the ground. Soil bears witness. The earth is not passive matter, but a participant in covenant. When boundaries are violated, the land suffers alongside humanity. The Watchers' influence intensifies this collapse through instruction. The knowledge they impart is not framed as neutral information, but as catalytic force. Metallurgy enables advanced weaponry. Astral knowledge shifts focus from divine order to manipulation of fate. Ritual practices promise power without accountability. Each category of instruction corresponds to a sphere traditionally regulated by priesthood or divine authority. Warfare, divination, and ritual were never private skills in ancient societies. They shaped collective destiny. By introducing such knowledge outside established structures, the Watchers dismantle safeguards designed to limit harm. The texts are careful to assign blame proportionately. Humanity participates, learns, and applies what it receives. Responsibility is shared, yet the primary culpability remains with those who introduced what humanity could not yet bear. Authority carries greater weight. Those who teach shape outcomes far beyond themselves. Divine response unfolds not as sudden annihilation, but as investigation. Ancient legal imagery dominates. Accusations are raised. Witnesses speak. Messengers deliver sentences. This process reinforces a central theological claim. Divine justice operates through order, not impulse. The Watchers are bound in specific locations associated with darkness and confinement. Their punishment mirrors their crime. Those who abandon their appointed place are fixed in place. Those who crossed boundaries are held beyond them. The restraint is both physical and symbolic. The fate of their offspring differs because their existence itself is the violation. They cannot be confined because there is no rightful space for them within creation. Their destruction is portrayed not as vengeance, but as correction. The world cannot heal while they remain embodied. Yet the texts insist that consequence does not end with physical death. The spirits of the giants persist, tethered to the earth, but denied form. This condition explains their hostility. They are beings without rest, without purpose, and without future. Their violence continues in a different mode. This belief shapes later Jewish understanding of unclean spirits. These entities are not fallen angels in the classical sense. They are remnants of a disrupted order, lingering evidence of a boundary once broken. Their presence serves as ongoing testimony to the cost of transgression. The flood narrative that follows in Scripture becomes, in this light, a final act of containment. Water cleanses what blood polluted. Life is preserved through separation once more. Boundaries are reestablished. Humanity is given another beginning under renewed limits. What is striking is the restraint with which the canonical text handles all of this. It states almost nothing, and yet implies everything. The fuller tradition exists to explain what Scripture assumes. Silence becomes signal. Brevity becomes weight. The story of the Watchers, as preserved through these ancient lenses, is not merely about angels or giants. It is about responsibility, limit, and consequence. It warns that when those entrusted with oversight choose participation instead, disorder follows not only for themselves, but for all who live beneath their influence. In this worldview, creation survives only when every realm remains within its appointed place. When that balance is broken, even the earth itself bears the wound. The beings born from the union of Watchers and human women are described with language that deliberately resists simplification. Ancient authors employ multiple terms to capture what they represent, not merely what they look like. They are called mighty ones, violent ones, men whose names endure. Each phrase carries cultural weight, signaling reputation, domination, and memory shaped by fear rather than honor. The word, often translated as giants, does not originate primarily as a measurement of height. In ancient Semitic thought, it conveyed overwhelming presence. A giant was one who overshadowed others, whose strength distorted social balance. Size, when mentioned, functions as a metaphor for unchecked power as much as physical scale. These beings loom over communities, economies, and moral life. Archaeological and literary parallels from the wider ancient Near East help clarify this imagery. Many cultures preserved stories of primordial figures who ruled before the present age, remembered as builders, warriors, and tyrants. These figures are rarely portrayed as benevolent founders. They belong to a violent past that had to be erased for civilization to continue. Jewish writers adapt this shared memory, but recast it through a moral lens. In this framework, the offspring of the Watchers are not heroes of a lost golden age. They are warnings. Their fame is not admiration, but notoriety. Their names endure because they are associated with devastation. Memory itself becomes a form of judgment. The texts emphasize how these beings disrupt human society from within. They do not merely attack from outside. They integrate themselves into human structures, assuming leadership, extracting tribute, and bending systems to their will. Their strength grants authority, but without accountability. Power replaces justice. Ancient societies were acutely aware of the danger posed by such figures. Kingship itself was viewed with suspicion unless restrained by law and covenant. A ruler without limits was indistinguishable from a monster. The giants represent the extreme form of this fear. Leadership divorced entirely from moral obligation. Consumption remains a defining trait. The texts describe these beings exhausting human resources, devouring produce, livestock, and eventually people. This progression reflects a known pattern. When power becomes insatiable, exploitation escalates. What begins as taxation becomes plunder. What begins as dominance becomes annihilation. The writers frame this appetite as unnatural. Creation is designed around sufficiency, cycles, and renewal. Excess consumption signals dislocation from those rhythms. The giants take without replenishing, severing the reciprocal relationship between humanity and land. Their presence turns sustenance into scarcity. This dynamic links directly to violence. When resources collapse, conflict follows. Communities fracture. Survival becomes competition. Bloodshed fills the land not because humans are inherently violent, but because conditions have been engineered toward desperation. The giants create an environment where cruelty becomes normalized. The watcher's responsibility in this outcome is never obscured. Though the giants act independently, their existence is traced back to a decision made in the heavens. Authority that introduces distortion bears responsibility for its effects. Ancient theology insists that influence flows downward. Corruption at the top multiplies below. The texts also suggest that these beings possess heightened awareness and cunning. They are not brute animals. They organize, strategize, and impose systems. Their intelligence amplifies their threat. Power combined with knowledge accelerates collapse. This combination explains why ancient authors viewed the situation as irreversible through ordinary means. Human resistance cannot prevail. Justice cannot function. Law cannot restrain those who exist beyond its categories. The problem exceeds human capacity to resolve. Divine intervention, when described, is framed as necessity rather than spectacle. The removal of these beings is not portrayed as triumph, but as restoration. Order must be reasserted because creation itself is unraveling. The decision to intervene reflects concern for continuity rather than punishment alone. The destruction of the giants is depicted with finality. Their bodies perish, their dominance ends, their systems collapse. Yet, the texts insist that consequence does not vanish with physical death. Something persists, something unresolved. The spirits of these beings are described as remaining within the earthly realm, severed from both heaven and embodied life. This condition is portrayed as deprivation rather than empowerment. They wander because they have no place. They afflict because they have no purpose. This belief answers a question that haunted ancient communities. Why does violence continue even after violent regimes fall? Why does corruption persist after tyrants die? The answer offered is unsettling. Some wounds inflicted upon creation do not heal quickly. Their effects linger across generations. These spirits are not granted the status of divine beings. They are diminished, restless, and constrained. Their power lies not in strength, but in influence. They provoke, distort, and entice, echoing the excess that defined their former existence. This understanding reshapes later discussions of evil. It is not an abstract force, but the residue of historical violation. It arises from specific acts that fractured order. In this view, the world remains haunted not by myth, but by memory. The narrative thus ties the present to the primordial past. Human struggle is linked to ancient decisions made beyond human control, yet affecting human reality. This connection does not absolve humanity of responsibility. It explains the depth of the challenge humanity faces. The story of the giants, as preserved in these traditions, is therefore not about monstrous beings alone. It is about what happens when power, knowledge, and desire operate without boundary. It is a reflection on leadership, appetite, and the fragility of social order. By the time these traditions were recorded, their purpose was clear. They were not meant to satisfy curiosity about ancient monsters. They were meant to explain why the world feels resistant to justice, why violence resurfaces, and why restoration requires more than human effort. In this telling, the bloodline created by the Watchers does not simply disappear. It leaves a scar upon history, one that later generations are forced to navigate. And in that scar, ancient writers located the enduring struggle between order and chaos that defines human existence. The escalation of violence described in these traditions is not portrayed as sudden chaos, but as a steady unraveling. Ancient writers emphasize progression. What begins as imbalance becomes domination, and domination matures into total collapse. This sequence reflects a worldview in which moral failure compounds over time, shaping structures that eventually sustain cruelty as normal. Bloodshed in these texts is never merely physical, it is relational. Violence fractures kinship, erodes trust, and dissolves obligation. Communities lose the capacity to protect their weakest members. Justice ceases to function because power has replaced law. The world becomes governed by strength alone. This condition is described as filling the earth. The phrase is deliberate. It suggests saturation rather than frequency. Violence is no longer exceptional. It becomes atmospheric, something breathed rather than witnessed. Ancient audiences understood this as a sign that the created order itself was failing. In biblical thought, the earth is not inert. It participates in covenant. When injustice multiplies, the land responds. Blood cries out. Soil absorbs guilt. Agricultural failure is not random misfortune, but moral consequence. The environment mirrors the condition of its inhabitants. This belief appears repeatedly in Hebrew tradition. Fertility and faithfulness are intertwined. When law is upheld, the land yields. When injustice dominates, the land withholds. The crisis associated with the Watchers is therefore cosmic in scope. Heaven, earth, and humanity are all misaligned. The Watchers' contribution to this collapse extends beyond their offspring. Their instruction accelerates the breakdown of restraint. Metallurgy advances warfare beyond tribal conflict into organized slaughter. Magical practices undermine social cohesion by shifting authority from communal norms to individual power. Astral knowledge reorients trust away from divine order toward manipulation of fate. Each form of knowledge introduced corresponds to a sphere that ancient societies regulated carefully. Warfare was bounded by ritual and season. Divination was restricted to sanctioned figures. Craft knowledge was transmitted within guilds and families. The Watchers bypassed these structures entirely. This bypassing is key. The issue is not the content of the knowledge alone, but its delivery without moral framework. Knowledge divorced from responsibility becomes amplification. It multiplies human capacity for harm faster than wisdom can restrain it. Ancient Jewish writers understood knowledge as hierarchical. Some knowledge belonged to humanity, some belonged to priesthood, some belonged only to the divine. To violate this hierarchy was to destabilize creation itself. The Watchers are condemned not for teaching, but for teaching what was not theirs to give. Human participation is not denied. People receive, learn, and apply what they are taught. Responsibility remains shared. Yet the texts insist that accountability scales with authority. Those who introduce distortion bear greater guilt than those who inherit it. This principle governs the judgment that follows. Divine response is described as measured and ordered. Messengers are sent to declare sentences. Each participant receives consequence according to role. The Watchers are bound. Their offspring are destroyed. Humanity is preserved but constrained. The imprisonment of the Watchers is described using imagery of darkness, depth, and confinement. These are not arbitrary symbols. Darkness represents removal from function. Depth signifies separation from influence. Confinement restores boundary by force where obedience failed. The texts emphasize duration. The Watchers are not imprisoned briefly. They are held until a determined time. This reinforces the idea that their transgression has long-term consequence. The damage they caused cannot be undone quickly. Restoration requires patience and containment. The destruction of the giants differs in nature. They are eliminated because their existence itself violates order. They cannot be corrected, rehabilitated, or restrained. Their removal is portrayed as tragic necessity rather than triumph. The world cannot survive while they remain embodied. Yet consequence does not end with physical death. The spirits that persist are described as deprived rather than empowered. They wander because they have no rightful domain. Their hostility arises from loss, not authority. They influence by disruption, not command. This distinction shapes later Jewish and early Christian thought. Evil spirits are not rulers of darkness, but symptoms of a wound. They do not govern the world, they afflict it. Their existence testifies to a past failure that still echoes. The flood narrative that follows becomes intelligible within this framework. It is not an act of indiscriminate destruction. It is containment on a planetary scale. Water cleanses what blood polluted. Life is preserved through separation once more. Boundaries are restored by force where memory failed. The selection of survivors is not arbitrary. Preservation focuses on lineage capable of continuity. Humanity must be restarted without contamination. This emphasis reveals how deeply ancient authors valued genealogy as moral structure. Continuity matters only if it preserves order. After the flood, restrictions appear. Human lifespan is curtailed. Violence is regulated. Authority is limited. These measures reflect awareness. Something went wrong before. Safeguards are now necessary. The Watcher's story thus functions as prehistory for law itself. It explains why boundaries exist, why power must be checked, and why knowledge requires restraint. The law is not merely social contract. It is cosmic necessity. What ancient readers were meant to understand is sobering. Evil is not spontaneous. It is engineered through decisions made by those entrusted with authority. Once released, it embeds itself within systems, cultures, and memory. Restoration, therefore, is never simple. It requires removal, restraint, and renewal. Even then, traces remain. The world after the flood is not innocent. It is managed. In this worldview, the Watchers are not merely villains of an ancient story. They are a cautionary record. They demonstrate that even beings of immense knowledge can become sources of catastrophe when they abandon their appointed place. The lesson preserved in these texts is precise. Order survives only when every realm honors its limits. When those limits are violated, the consequences extend far beyond the original act, shaping history long after the transgressors themselves are restrained. And it is within this lingering aftermath that later traditions locate the ongoing struggle humanity continues to face. After the flood, traditions describe the removal of the giants and the binding of the Watchers. The texts shift their focus from destruction to aftermath. Ancient authors were less interested in spectacle than in consequence. They sought to explain why the world that emerged afterward was quieter, smaller, and more restrained, yet still marked by unrest and moral tension. The spirits said to remain after the death of the giants occupy a unique category. They are not portrayed as heavenly beings cast down from above, nor as ordinary human souls. Their existence is anomalous. Born from a violation of realms, they belong fully to neither. This liminal status defines their nature and behavior. Second Temple Jewish literature describes these spirits as earthbound. They cannot ascend because their origin was not heavenly in purity. They cannot rest because they were not created according to human order. Their confinement to the earthly sphere is not a privilege, but a punishment. They wander because there is nowhere they are permitted to remain. This belief provides an explanatory framework for later discussions of unclean spirits. These entities are associated with desolation, ruin, and abandonment. They dwell in wastelands, ruins, and places stripped of life. Such locations symbolize what they represent: spaces where order has collapsed. Their influence is described in psychological and social terms rather than cosmic authority. They provoke violence, distort judgment, and intensify desire. They do not create evil from nothing. They amplify what already exists. Their power lies in disruption, not sovereignty. Ancient writers emphasize that these spirits lack bodies and therefore seek embodiment indirectly. This desire explains their fixation on human experience. They tempt, oppress, and afflict not out of strategy, but out of deprivation. What they lost with physical death cannot be recovered, only imitated. This understanding sharply distinguishes them from the Watchers themselves. The Watchers retain identity, memory, and accountability. They are imprisoned because they remain moral agents. The spirits of the giants are fragments, remnants of a failed existence. They are not judged further because they have already lost everything. The texts also stress limitation. These spirits are not omnipresent. They do not command armies. They are constrained by divine order, though they resist it. Their activity persists only because the world they inhabit still bears the scars of the earlier transgression. This framework reshapes how evil is understood. Evil is not an independent force competing with the divine. It is residual damage. It is the after effect of authority misused and boundaries violated. It persists not because it is equal in power, but because history cannot be undone. The restraint imposed after the flood reflects this awareness. Human lifespan is shortened. Violence is regulated through law. Bloodshed is explicitly condemned. These measures are preventative, not reactionary. They acknowledge vulnerability rather than deny it. Genealogy regains importance. Lineage is carefully preserved, named, and remembered. This emphasis reflects a renewed commitment to boundary. Identity must be traceable. Continuity must be protected. The confusion introduced by mixed realms cannot be allowed to reemerge. Later, biblical narratives echo this concern repeatedly. Prohibitions against certain unions, rituals, and practices are not arbitrary. They reflect a fear of boundary erosion. Holiness in this context means separation, aligned with purpose. The memory of the Watchers lingers beneath these laws. Though rarely named explicitly, their story shapes how later writers understand temptation, corruption, and power. Knowledge remains dangerous when pursued without restraint. Authority remains perilous when detached from obedience. Early Christian writers inherit this framework and adapt it. They speak of spiritual opposition, but always within limits. Evil spirits are depicted as subject to judgment, not co-rulers of the world. Their influence is real, but constrained. This continuity reveals that the Watchers' tradition was never marginal folklore. It functioned as interpretive infrastructure. It explained why the world requires vigilance, why moral failure spreads, and why restoration demands more than instruction. The story also addresses a deeper anxiety. If divine beings could fail, what hope does humanity have? The answer offered is not despair, but structure. Failure occurs when roles are abandoned. Stability returns when roles are honored. The Watchers fell not because they were created flawed, but because they chose participation over purpose. Humanity is warned not to repeat this error. Desire must remain subordinate to responsibility. Knowledge must remain within wisdom. In this way, the lingering spirits become reminders rather than rulers. Their presence testifies to the cost of transgression. They haunt not because they are victorious, but because they are unresolved. The ancient authors did not promise a world free from struggle. They promised a world governed by order, where struggle could be confronted without collapsing creation itself. Boundaries would not eliminate evil entirely, but they would contain it. This containment defines the post-flood world. Humanity lives within limits not as punishment, but as protection. Law, memory, and separation become safeguards learned through catastrophe. The legacy of the Watchers thus continues quietly. It informs caution, humility, and restraint. It warns that power, once misused, leaves echoes that endure long after the original actors are removed. And it is within this restrained, scarred world that later hopes for final restoration begin to take shape. As the memory of the Watchers receded into the background of Scripture, their legacy did not disappear. Instead, it became embedded in how later Jewish tradition understood law, holiness, and separation. The concern was no longer about heavenly beings descending, but about humanity repeating the same pattern through its own choices. The danger had shifted from cosmic rebellion to cultural imitation. Ancient writers increasingly framed holiness as boundary maintenance. To be set apart did not mean withdrawal from the world, but alignment with proper order. Certain practices, relationships, and forms of knowledge were restricted not because they were inherently evil, but because they carried the risk of reenacting earlier violations. The past served as warning rather than myth. This anxiety is visible in later legal traditions that emphasize distinction between clean and unclean, sacred and common, permitted and forbidden. These categories were not arbitrary. They functioned as protective barriers. Each boundary reinforced the lesson learned from primordial collapse. When distinctions erode, disorder follows. The Watcher's story thus informed how temptation itself was understood. Desire was not condemned outright. It was dangerous only when it sought what was not assigned. Knowledge was not rejected. It was dangerous only when pursued without authorization. Power was not evil. It was dangerous only when exercised without accountability. This framework shaped later interpretations of transgression. Sin was not merely moral failure, it was misalignment. To sin was to step outside one's appointed place. The language of wandering, straying, and falling reflects this spatial understanding of morality. Evil was movement in the wrong direction. In this context, later prophetic warnings take on deeper resonance. When prophets condemn violence, exploitation, and arrogance, they are not simply addressing social injustice. They are identifying symptoms of boundary collapse. The same pattern that once began in the heavens now reappears within human societies. Kings who exalt themselves beyond law echo the giants. Priests who misuse sacred knowledge echo the watchers. Empires that devour nations echo the insatiable appetite described in ancient texts. History becomes cyclical, not because fate demands it, but because lessons are forgotten. Second Temple literature reflects an acute awareness of this repetition. Writers emphasize vigilance, discipline, and remembrance. The past is rehearsed not to glorify it, but to prevent its return. Apocalyptic language intensifies because the stakes are understood. Another collapse would not be merely political, it would be cosmic. Within this worldview, divine judgment is consistently portrayed as restorative rather than annihilating. Even when destruction occurs, it aims to reestablish order. Judgment corrects trajectory. It restrains what threatens to overflow. This understanding preserves hope without denying consequence. The binding of the watchers becomes a paradigm. Those who misuse authority are restrained. Those who violate boundaries are limited. Evil is curtailed, not allowed to reign unchecked. History continues because containment succeeds. This containment also explains why divine patience appears alongside severity. Immediate eradication would not heal creation. Memory, law, and discipline must take root. Humanity must learn restraint rather than merely fear punishment. The lingering presence of disruptive spirits reinforces this lesson. Their continued influence reminds communities that vigilance is necessary. The world remains vulnerable. Order requires maintenance. Forgetfulness invites repetition. Early Christian writers adopt this framework and reinterpret it through their own theological lens. They speak of spiritual struggle not as equal warfare between powers, but as resistance within a constrained field. Evil operates under limit. Authority belongs elsewhere. This reinterpretation preserves the central claim of earlier tradition. The ultimate threat is not external invasion, but internal abandonment of purpose. The Watchers fell by leaving their station. Humanity falters when it does the same. In this way, the ancient story transcends its mythic imagery. It becomes a lens through which power, knowledge, and desire are evaluated across time. The question is no longer whether heavenly beings once descended, but whether humanity will ascend beyond its own limits. The Watcher's bloodline no longer walks the earth in embodied form, yet its influence survives in structures of domination, excess, and exploitation. These patterns are recognizable precisely because they have appeared before. History carries their imprint. The ancient authors were not pessimists. They believed order could be sustained, boundaries could be honored, knowledge could be stewarded wisely. But they were realists. They knew the cost of forgetting. Thus, the tradition moves toward expectation. If disorder entered history through violation, restoration must come through alignment. If corruption spread through misplaced authority, healing must arrive through rightful obedience. The Watcher's story, once expanded to explain the past, now functions to shape the future. It urges restraint without fear, knowledge without arrogance, and power without domination. And in this restrained hope, the narrative prepares for a final question that ancient writers left open: whether creation, once fractured by boundary breaking, can one day be fully restored without repeating the catastrophe that first scarred it. By the time these traditions reached their later stages, the story of the Watchers had shifted from explanation to expectation. Ancient writers no longer treated it solely as an account of what went wrong, but as a framework for understanding what still needed to be resolved. The past was unfinished. Its consequences remained active within the present. This awareness shaped emerging ideas about time and history. History was no longer viewed as endless repetition, but as movement toward rectification. If disorder had entered the world through a specific violation, then order would ultimately require a deliberate act of restoration. Justice would not be complete until every breach was addressed. The imprisonment of the Watchers, described as lasting until an appointed time, became central to this expectation. Their confinement was not portrayed as eternal by default, but as temporary within a larger plan. Time itself became a tool of judgment. Waiting served a purpose. The delay underscored that resolution would arrive only when creation was prepared to receive it. This perspective explains why ancient apocalyptic writings emphasize revelation rather than novelty. They do not announce new truths. They unveil what has been hidden. The future is presented as disclosure, the moment when concealed structures of authority are finally exposed and corrected. Within this framework, the Watchers are no longer merely transgressors of the past. They become witnesses against themselves. Their continued confinement stands as evidence that rebellion fails and that misuse of authority is never forgotten. Their memory functions as testimony in a cosmic court that has not yet adjourned. Humanity's role within this unfolding expectation is complex. People are not blamed for the original transgression, yet they live within its consequences. The world they inhabit is not neutral ground. It is shaped by prior disorder. This reality explains why struggle persists even when law is observed and intention is good. Ancient writers did not interpret this condition as injustice. They understood it as inheritance. Just as virtue can be transmitted through memory and teaching, damage can be transmitted through history. Humanity inherits a compromised world and must navigate it with wisdom rather than denial. This inheritance clarifies the emphasis placed on endurance. Faithfulness is framed not as immediate triumph, but as sustained alignment over time. Righteousness does not eliminate opposition instantly. It resists corruption gradually. Patience becomes a moral act. The lingering presence of disruptive spirits reinforces this ethic. Their activity tests discernment rather than overpowering will. They deceive, entice, and distort, but they do not compel. Human agency remains intact. Responsibility remains real. This balance is crucial. Evil is acknowledged without becoming deterministic. Influence exists without absolving choice. Ancient theology insists that while humanity is affected by past violations, it is not controlled by them. As eschatological hope develops, restoration is described as comprehensive. It is not limited to human morality alone. Land, society, and even the heavens are included. What was fractured across realms must be healed across realms. The Watcher's narrative provides the logic for this scope. Since the violation was cosmic, restoration must be cosmic. Since boundaries were broken at multiple levels, they must be reestablished at every level. Partial repair would be insufficient. This expectation shapes later visions of judgment. They are not presented as arbitrary destruction, but as final separation. What does not belong is removed. What belongs is preserved. Order is restored by clarity rather than force. In this light, judgment is not feared as annihilation, but anticipated as resolution. Confusion ends. Mixture ceases. Each realm returns to its purpose. Creation breathes again without distortion. The fate of the Watchers within this expectation is decisive. Their story does not conclude with escape or reconciliation. It concludes with confirmation. Their violation stands as fixed reference. They are remembered not to be feared, but to be understood. This understanding reframes the narrative's emotional center. The focus is no longer on monstrous beings or forbidden unions. It rests on the integrity of order itself. The universe is depicted as moral structure, not chaotic arena. Human hope within this structure is grounded in alignment rather than conquest. Victory comes not through domination, but through remaining within appointed bounds. The ancient failure is not undone by power, but by obedience. The Watcher's bloodline, which once dominated the earth, has no future in this vision. Its remnants fade as clarity increases. Influence diminishes as memory sharpens. Disorder loses ground as understanding deepens. Thus, the ancient authors leave their audience not with fear, but with responsibility. Knowing what went wrong demands vigilance. Remembering the cost of violation demands restraint. The story presses toward its conclusion by insisting on a final truth. History is moving, not circling. The catastrophe of the past is not destined to repeat indefinitely. It awaits resolution. And with that expectation firmly in place, the narrative prepares for its final statement, one that draws together boundary, authority, memory, and hope into a single, closing vision of restored order. The ancient tradition surrounding the Watchers was not with spectacle, but with meaning. Its final concern is not the beings who fell, nor the bloodline that vanished, but the structure of reality that endured despite violation. Order, though wounded, was not erased. Boundaries, though broken, were not abandoned. In this conclusion, the universe is presented as morally coherent. Actions carry weight across time. Authority leaves traces. Nothing of consequence simply disappears. The Watcher's transgression is remembered precisely because it revealed something permanent about creation. Power is never neutral, and knowledge is never isolated from responsibility. The story insists that hierarchy is not oppression, but protection. Distinction between realms exists to preserve life, not to restrict it. When those distinctions are honored, creation functions. When they are violated, even divine beings contribute to collapse. The bloodline created by the Watchers did not survive because it could not. It represented a contradiction embedded into existence. What has no rightful place cannot endure indefinitely. Its removal was not an act of cruelty. of necessity. Yet the memory of that bloodline remains essential. It explains why limits exist. It explains why ancient law emphasizes separation, restraint, and humility. It explains why wisdom traditions warn against grasping for what is not given. The Watchers themselves fade from prominence because their role is finished. They are no longer active agents in history. They are fixed reference points. Their confinement marks the boundary of permissible authority. They stand as evidence that even the highest beings are accountable. The lingering effects of their actions do not undermine this accountability. They reinforce it. The world still bears scars, not because justice failed, but because justice works through time. Healing requires memory. Restoration requires patience. In this final vision, humanity is not portrayed as helpless victim of cosmic events. Humanity is entrusted with a lesson purchased at enormous cost. Knowledge must be stewarded. Desire must be governed. Power must remain aligned with purpose. The Watcher's story ultimately redirects attention away from the heavens and back toward the human condition. The most dangerous violations are not those imposed from above, but those repeated below. History warns because humanity listens only when consequence becomes visible. Ancient writers preserved this narrative not to glorify fear, but to cultivate discernment. The true threat was never monstrous beings alone. It was the abandonment of assigned roles, the confusion of purpose, and the erosion of boundary. The final hope offered by the tradition is quiet but firm. Order can be sustained. Creation can endure. Violation is not inevitable. Memory itself becomes a safeguard. In this understanding, the Watchers did not change the destiny of the world forever. They revealed what happens when destiny is ignored. Their failure clarified the conditions under which life flourishes. The story ends where it began, with separation upheld as sacred, authority bound to responsibility, and knowledge framed by wisdom. Nothing more is required. Nothing less will suffice. And so, the ancient warning stands intact across centuries, not as myth, not as speculation, but as record. A record of what was crossed, what was lost, and what must never be crossed again.